hours in the southeast, and 7 counties were declared flood disaster. So maybe on average for the summer we had the average amount of rain, but within the month of August, you had most of the state drought disaster, and then 7 counties flood disaster right away. So if this is emblematic of future climate, and it seems to be, this is a prediction of the climate scientists that really seems to be holding up, that's bad news for us environmentally, economically, and in every other way. This is, again, from Mark Seeley. The average ice out date for the state has gone from about 113 day of the year down to 102, about a 10-day change in the last 60 years, averaging across all lakes that are measured in the state. And up here in northern Minnesota, very good climate records from the Cloquet Forestry Center showing about a 2-degree increase in temperature already since 1940, with similar data shown here in the dotted lines, the Tower of Winton. We don't have as good climate records there, but it seems to be tracking a couple of degrees cooler, but increasing up in this part of the world as well. And at least for Cloquet in the last 60 years, no general tendency to get wetter or drier. What this will look like going on to 2060, we don't have any idea. Certainly, my guess is it's going to continue to get warmer and warmer. What will happen to precipitation, even the climate scientists can't predict very well. Now, not surprisingly, it gets warmer, and climate moves north, so to speak. The entire boreal forest is predicted to move north by 300 miles or so with a doubling of CO2. Climate models and ecological models going back many years suggest this. So getting back to our question, what's the future in northern Minnesota? Well, it depends on what happens to climate, both directly and indirectly. And we can ask about different tree species, how they might respond to warmer climate. We would expect species like jack pine, red pine, spruce, birch, aspen, and tamarack to decrease in abundance if it gets warmer because they don't do as well further south of here where it's warmer. We might think, hey, maybe species such as sugar maple, red maple, white pine, basswood, and the oaks might increase in abundance or migrate in, but we don't necessarily have suitable soils for most of these species. They require richer soils than most of the boundary water soils. And many of these are not fire adapted. Well, how about species like hickory, white oak, or black cherry that might be really well suited for the climate of 2050 or 2070? Well, they may not get here. They may not be able to migrate in because fragmentation of the landscape and even the inherently slow pace of tree migration might mean they don't get here very quickly. So these are questions more than answers. And it gets more complicated if you think about interaction with fire, deer, invasive species, diseases, and rising carbon dioxide that all have their own effects on individual tree species. Paper by Lee Frelich and I this year lays out complex interactions among many of these different drivers of climate change and forest change. I'll simplify this by just suggesting there are maybe 4 or 5 different forces that may push Minnesota forests more towards savannas, less towards forests, and especially in the north here. Warmer, drier conditions support fewer trees. That's just ecological common sense all around the world. Secondly, both invasive and native insects and diseases are going to get worse and already have. In the western Canada, there's huge outbreaks of diseases that are killing vast extents of forests. Life cycle of insects and diseases allows them to have more generations faster, and they become more virulent. Deer are preventing reproduction. It's a huge problem in most of the temperate forests, but deer have been moving north probably for 50 or 100 years here, both due to climate change and what we're doing to the landscape and what we're doing to their predators. And deer eat most of our tree species, but especially love cedar, white pine, and several others. So they're having a big impact. And then windstorm and fire frequency may increase, and that will slow down and negatively impact many of our tree species. So these are collectively direct and indirect drivers of climate change that may all thin out our forests in northeastern Minnesota and elsewhere. Now, those are mostly hypotheses that make sense, and we and many others are studying this using models, using observational studies, gradient studies. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our direct warming experiment study that you're invited to come look at after my talk here. this afternoon on Fall Lake. And we call this Before Warm, which stands for Boreal Forest Warming at an Ecotone in Danger. I'm going to share some early results today with you. This is a unique experiment, no other experiment in the whole world that's heating plants and soils to try to look at direct effects of warming on changes in forest composition. Now the north of the blue line here, north and east, was the pre-settlement extent of boreal forest, basically the location of spruce and fir. And our two experimental sites are at the Cloquet Forestry Center, which is quite close to that biome boundary, and the Hubachek Wilderness Research Center, now a University of Minnesota facility, out on Fall Lake about 7 miles from here. And for the climate context, the Union of Concerned Scientists did some analysis a few years back, which shows that children born in 2005 to 2010 may experience Kansas-like summers in Minnesota in their lifetime. That's really shocking. The yellow or tan areas is the current state boundaries and climate. And if we look at what the climate prediction is for 2095 in the summer temperatures in Minnesota may be a lot like those in Kansas and Nebraska. And winter temperatures will be even warmer. Summer is predicted to be 7 to 16 degrees Fahrenheit warmer by 2095. That's an enormous degree of climate change. That's not just like a degree or two. And that's almost certainly have to have enormous impacts on every aspect of what happens in this part of the world. So our experiment is here to look at a little bit of this, and we're focusing on 10 important tree species. 5 species we characterize as true boreal species, and 5 as cold temperate. And we characterize these based on their distribution, their range geographically. The 5 boreal species, balsam fir, paper birch, jack pine, white spruce, and trembling aspen, all have their southwestern edge of their distribution in northern Minnesota. They go much farther north and northeast. There's white spruce, trembling aspen goes a bit further south, but they all have their southern end in Minnesota or a bit further south. In contrast, the 5 cold temperate species, 2 maples, 2 oaks, and white pine, grow throughout much of eastern North America, but have their northwestern boundary here in northern Minnesota. True of red maple, sugar maple, and red oak. So, although these maples, oaks, and birches, aspen, fir, and pine are part of our mental picture of northern Minnesota or central Minnesota, they actually represent very different biomes. And so it's a place where these biome boundaries are likely to shift with climate change. And common sense suggests that if it gets warmer, the species adapted to the warmer, more southerly environment, the maples and oaks and the white pine, should do better than the spruce, fir, and birch. But we don't really know that. The other thing I want to point out is that if we have Kansas-like summers in 2095, well, none of these 10 species currently have Kansas as their home. There's Kansas on the map. Even the timber species grow much further east, where it's not as hot and not as dry as it is in Kansas. So maybe if it really gets hot and dry, none of these species will do well in the future here. So what our experiment is set up to do is to look very specifically at just warming effects at a very local scale. We have these 2 sites that I mentioned, 2 habitats, open and understory, to characterize the 2 main habitats in forests. Open either following things such as blowdown or fires or logging, and understory in intact condition. And we're warming by about 3 degrees Fahrenheit or 6 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're warming both plants and soils using infrared lamps and soil heating cable technology. As I mentioned, we're the first experiment to actually use both of these in the world, and it's a technological nightmare to do so, which is why no one else has done it before. But it seemed to us to make sense if you're actually going to try to mimic real warming. In the future, both the above ground parts of the plants and the below ground plots will both be warmed. So it doesn't make sense to us to do an experiment warming only one part of the plant. And our central objective is actually very simple. Nothing high-tech about this. It's just to assess the potential for climate warming to alter the composition of our forests at the southern boreal temperate forest ecotone. Again, here's our 10 main tree species, arrayed now by the